We are going to practice once again introducing quotations. Quotes that we want to use in our writing, and we want it to flow a little better than just having one sentence of our own, then the quote plopped in. Another sentence of our own, then the quote plopped in. What we want to do is give a piece of background information so that the reader knows what we're talking about, and then lead right into the quote, having that comma and the quotation mark starting up. We're going to start by sharing a student example from the last time we did this. This is Billy's. Notice where the quote is. Do you see where this quote is? Pause this and point it out. If you realize that the quote starts here and ends right here, you've got it. And we know that because Billy used quotation marks. Now, where is Billy's introduction to this quote? Pause this and find it again. If you found it right over here, you're correct. He says here, Frederick Douglass shares that slavery is hard by saying, and then he goes right into the quote. What we could use is probably a comma right here. Usually you have to have a comma before your quote. This just separates your thoughts from the actual quote one more time. Let's try another example. Here's Emily's example from the last time. See if you can find the actual quote. Pause this now. The actual quote is right here. It starts here. I have known him to cut and slash the women's heads so horribly, and ends here. And we know this because we can find the quotation marks there. Now find the lead in to this quote. Pause this now. If you found the lead in right here, you are correct. Frederick Douglass talks about how cruel it was to be a slaveholder by explaining, comma, she added that little comma there, I have known him to cut and slash into women's heads so horribly. So what she did here with this little arrow, she had written Mr. Plummer up above here. So she was going to add a little bit more information to the reader so that we know who the slaveholder is and who is actually him. So how can we introduce that quote a little bit better, just adding that Mr. Plummer in there? How can we make it fit so it flows smoothly? Please try this now. Pause here. It would be great if we could share our answers together, but since it's a video, we cannot. The simplest thing I thought of was to add the words about Mr. Plummer. So if we say Frederick Douglass talks about Mr. Plummer and how cruel it was to be a slaveholder, we could add it there, or we can add it over on the right. Frederick Douglass talks about how cruel it was to be a slaveholder by explaining about Mr. Plummer. But this sounds like a complete sentence, so actually I would not put it over here. I would keep it right here. Frederick Douglass talks about Mr. Plummer and how cruel it was to be a slaveholder by explaining. There we go. Let's try another example. We're going to try this one together. There we've got the quote. He used to boast of the commission of the awful and bloody deed. We know this is the quote because we see the quotation mark here and here. It also has what chapter and paragraph it's in, which we've been missing, but we didn't stress that the last time. Let's see if we can add that this time. How, if you wanted to talk about this quote, would you introduce it? Now know that you are going to need to know who he is. So let's find instances of he. He used to boast of the commission of the awful and bloody deed. There's something else in here that your readers won't know what you're talking about unless you tell them. So we need to figure out who he is. We need to figure out who he is, but what else do we need to tell our readers about? What is this awful and bloody deed? We need to make sure we tell our readers about that. So let's try this on our own. What you're going to be doing It's not erasing for me. What you're going to be doing is figuring out how to lead into this quote, making sure that you explain who he is and what this awful and bloody deed is. If you need to know more, of course, you can go to chapter 4, paragraph 6 to find out what's going on in this sentence. Go ahead and try this, and we'll talk about your answers in a minute. Time for a new one. He dealt sparingly with his words and bountifully with his hip. Stop this for a second and talk about what your reader does not know about this quote. So now we need to make sure that when we write an introduction to this quote, we mention who he is and what is going on in this quote. Go ahead and look at chapter 4, paragraph 3 to figure this one out. Pause here until you're ready for the next one. Our last one to try is his reply, as well as I can remember, that Denby had become unmanageable. Please go ahead and look at chapter 4, paragraph 5, figure out what we need to talk about in this quote, and then write the lead in, and we will share our answers. Now that it's time to write your prompt, you're going to be looking at a lead into the quote that has a comma, and then it starts your quote that you have chosen. You might also want to write the chapter and paragraph that you found it, but you also need to provide the background information so that your readers know what you're talking about. And if you don't do this, they won't have a clue. This is one way to make your writing a little more sophisticated. You don't need to do this every time, but it is something to mix in so that your readers will stay engaged with your text. Go ahead, try this, and enjoy.